Yeah.
What about me?
Okay, I was like,
You are fan, sir.
Are we all about ready? I'm ready. All right, so go ahead and start on. All right, I'm John Butler. I'm the academic director, or one of the academic directors of the K. Bailey Hutchison Center for Energy Law and Business. We are co-hosting this with the Energy Symposium. So for the students that are in the class, thank you for coming. We appreciate your attendance. Can you go to the next slide, Eric? Can you go to the next slide, Eric? Thank you, sir. Your next one coming up is going to be, and I was told that it's not Daniel Cohan, it's Cohan. So Daniel Cohan, when you meet him, be sure to pronounce it correctly. We'll be here next week talking about confronting climate gridlock, technologies to unlock the clean energy future. I will also get a little pitch on Wednesday, the 27th of April. KDH is going to host an event called Women in Energy. It's open to everybody, of course, but all the panelists will be women describing their career paths, ups and downs, bumps, et cetera, as they've gone through the industry. So look for that. That'll be again Wednesday, the 27th from 5 to 7 p.m. Happy hour included. Be there, be square. Should be fun. Eric, can you go to the next slide? I'm not going to read the abstract to you, but you know why you're here today, right? We're going to talk a little bit about ESG. Probably more on the E than the S or the G. If that doesn't make sense, it will pretty soon. But the idea is to think about, in my mind, do we need financial subsidies, or will the world put pressure on companies to change? Is loosely how you might think about it, right? So do we need to pay people to stop flaring, or will the investors put pressure on them to stop flaring? Right, we'll have to see. Okay, next slide, please, there. I'm going to read Castlen's bio for you. Castlen is an alum of UT, most importantly, but she's vice president for communications and public affairs for Apache Corporation, a publicly traded global exploration and production company. She oversees Apache's internal and external communication strategies, government affairs efforts, and community investment and engagement. Prior to her role at Apache, she held varied leadership roles in government affairs, investor relations, and public relations at Apache. Before joining Apache, she served as a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy, as a business analyst at S&B Infrastructure, and as a financial analyst on the commodities desk at RWA Americas and Enron Corporation. Castlen currently serves as the president of Texas Lyceum, a leadership organization committed to civil discourse on issues important to the future of Texas. She also serves on the advisory council of the College of Natural Sciences at UT, as an advisor to the Energy and Earth Resources program in the Jackson School of Geosciences. She also serves as a board member for TexOGA, the Texas Oil and Gas Association, and as a board member for Springboard, a nonprofit dedicated to the education of young girls in Egypt. In partnership with Apache, Springboard has built 201 schools for girls across the country. Castlen holds a bachelor's degree in finance, a master's degree in public affairs, and a master's degree in energy and earth resources, all from UT. What do you have against engineering, Castlen? You could have done the quad.
I got my exposure through Weber Energy Group.
I like it. That's a good answer. And I remember we were just discussing it when Castlen finished her degree. She drove away in a natural gas-fired vehicle to drive from Austin to Boston to prove that you could. So, and you made it, right?
I made it. We cut it close a couple of times, but we made it.
That's all right. It was 2011.
2010.
2010. Sorry, child prodigy. No problem. All right. So Leslie Beyer. Leslie Beyer is the CEO of the Energy Workforce and Technology Council in Houston, Texas. Working with the council's board of directors, she serves as primary advocate for the energy services sector and the key role it plays in providing reliable, affordable, and cleaner energy to the world. Highlights of Beyer's career include 15 years in Washington, D.C., serving in roles in the U.S. Senate, multiple presidential campaigns, the White House Executive Office of the President, U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most recently, she served as the Director of Member and Board Relations with the National Association of Manufacturers, collaborating with those member companies on targeted priority legislative issues and advocacy efforts, primarily in the energy industry. Beyer holds a BA in Latin American Studies in Spanish from the University of Texas at Austin. She's an independent director of the Board of Natural Gas Services Group in Midland, Texas, serving on the Audit, ESG, and Compensation Committees. She also serves on the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston Board and World Oil's Editorial Advisory Board. She is a former independent director at Pemex Procurement International, PPI, and served on the U.S. International Trade Administration's U.S.-Mexico Energy Business Council. I think you know why they're here. Right? This is going to be a very good discussion, but I want to emphasize the word discussion. It'll be a lot more fun, right, if there's some interaction between the two of you, me, and you in the audience. So when you have questions as they come up, raise your hand. Eric will alert me if someone on Zoom comes up with a good one. But we have a few to start with, and so let me just go ahead and get us started, and then we'll circle back and see if y'all have any questions, okay? So the first thing I want to talk about is, we hear a lot about ESG, but how do your organizations think about it? Like, what is it? How do you define it? And what role does it play in the energy sector? So if you're closest to me, Leslie, would you go ahead and start?
Sure. What I do in my job every day is represent the oilfield services sector of the industry, which is actually the largest group of energy employees. It's about 600,000 employees that work across energy systems, primarily oil and gas, but increasingly within renewables. And we advocate on their behalf. One of the things that we advocate on is helping educate them on how to approach ESG. Some of them, you may recognize the Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, NOV. Those are the larger oilfield service providers. They were aware of and engaging in ESG, 3 and 4 years ago, but a lot of the power behind the oilfield services sector is right there in the middle, in the mid-cap companies. And they're just kind of wrapping their minds around, how do we report everything in environmental? How do we report our emissions? How do we set targets? How do we shore up our governance? How do we make sure we have diversity on our boards? How do we look at the social piece, and talk about all the great things that they're doing in the communities where they're active? Historically, these companies are kind of quiet. They're the contractors to the big oil companies. So they're behind the scenes. They're not talking about everything they're doing. And part of my role is to help them understand that ESG is an opportunity to showcase everything that they're doing. One of the most important things about that sector is that's where a lot of the emerging technologies around reducing emissions, methane detection, low carbon development, a lot of that comes from this sector. So the way we look at ESG is it's an opportunity. We have to learn how to produce sustainability reports and put metrics together to show what we're doing that's great. But above and beyond the production of traditional oil and gas systems, these companies develop the technology that will lead us to a lower carbon future. And for them, that's the great opportunity in ESG. And so through the council, we have certification programs, we have seminars. We just had a seminar yesterday on what the potential SEC rule could mean as far as their ESG reporting. And so the council works to educate them and to help them collaborate with their operator partners like Apache on how to better report for their customers.
So I'll start by saying ESG is a really interesting movement, and I would assume y'all have all heard the term, and it's definitely picked up a lot of steam here over the last few years. It's something that I think is pervasive in the way at the board level we're thinking about the future of the company and the strategy. But just to kind of break it down more specifically, ESG, and particularly the G, is where all this started. So G being governance. So for publicly traded companies like an Apache or like a lot of Leslie's members, the board works for the shareholders. And so publicly traded companies that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, they are actually voted on by the shareholder every year at the annual meeting. And there are things that they want to see in the way that the company is governed, hence the word governance, that lead to transparency for the shareholder, as well as strong risk management, so they know that their investment is protected under the stewardship of the board. And so governance is something that was really the initial focus. And the things that fall under governance are things like what the CEO earns, what his compensation or her compensation is, whether a board has a staggered board where they rotate off, what the diversity of the board may be. And that's not just diversity of gender or race, it includes experience. So increasingly, we're getting calls for more board members who have experience on the environmental side or carbon mitigation strategies or things like that. The E and the S, I think, have come a lot more into focus more recently. The E, particularly around the conversation around carbon and carbon management, and everything from our emissions with what we do day to day to what the emissions are downstream of what we do. And then the S is something that I think continues to evolve. And in some ways, the S is kind of everything else that's not environmental or governance. It's everything from D&I policies to community engagement and how you interact with broader stakeholders. But just one other thing I'll say about ESG that I think is really interesting, and I would argue the jury is still out on what the future of ESG will be, because there's lately, you just have to look at Elon Musk's Twitter feed to know that there's actually some questions about the role that ESG is increasingly playing in strategic decisions. So, and I just want to make this point because I think it's really important. Traditionally, for-profit companies were focused on one thing, and that was generating a return for their shareholders. And so they have today a legal and a fiduciary responsibility to manage that money in a way that minimizes risk and maximizes returns. ESG introduces a new requirement on the board, because as you can imagine, there's some things that you may be asked to do under the lens of ESG that may be in conflict with maximizing returns for a company. There's a group called the Business Roundtable, which is a really large collection of publicly traded companies and some of the largest CEOs in the world. Recently, I think it was a couple of years ago, they issued a statement around the concept of the purpose of a for-profit company is not just for the service of the shareholder, it's more broadly in service to the stakeholder, which is the employee, the people that live in the community where you operate, and things like that. And that is very notable, because that's a pretty big shift in the way we think about corporate America and the role of corporate America. And quite frankly, like I said, I think the jury's still out a little bit on how this is going to play out. So that would be
interesting. Thanks. In finance, when we talk about fiduciary responsibility, it used to be maximizing shareholder wealth. But if you shift that to shareholder value, the shareholders get to decide what they value. Right? And so if they value some of these ESG things, and in theory, they should substitute that for the financial returns. And that's where the jury's out, right? Is to see what people are willing to substitute. Right? Let's see, any questions about definitions before we get started? Anyone? All right, this is good. Castlen, how has Apache decided what to focus on with respect to ESG, right? Like, you've got to pick a lane and stick with it. What have you decided to focus on, and what is the feedback that you're getting from your shareholders given those choices?
Yeah, that's really important, because I think the challenge for a lot of companies is there are requests to do things in all sorts of spaces. And I think at some point, a company has to realize you have limited resources and limited staff to dedicate to solving some of these things. And so what we've decided to do at Apache is focus on the things that are within our direct control, and things where we really think we can have an impact. So there may be an issue that's important to somebody and important to society, but it doesn't really have to do with what we do. I'll give you guys an example. There's a lot of human rights issues that are very topical in the ESG space. One of them is child labor. Like, I agree, child labor is not a good thing, and we should be doing things to ensure that children across the world are protected across the supply chain. It's not something that comes directly into focus for us, and it's not something that's traditionally been a problem in our supply chain. So while we're certainly cognizant of the issue and we don't support child labor, it's not one of the key focus areas for us. And instead, we've defined our key focus areas in 3 ways, and that's air, water, and people. And we did that to really create a specific focus and say, where we're going to spend our time and our dollars is on reducing our emissions, whether that's methane or CO2, water, reducing freshwater consumption, and enabling water recycling throughout our operations. And then people is really both internally, our own people, our employees, maximizing learning and development opportunities, looking for opportunities to expand DEI, as well as kind of leadership development, that type of thing, as well as externally the people in the communities where we operate.
Thanks, Castlen. Leslie, you have a lot of members that probably have many, many different foci and many different objectives. Can you give us a sense of what aspects of the supply chain they're focused on, what pressures they're under from various stakeholders? So to pick up on what Castlen said, not just the shareholders, but everybody, the community and the people that work at the firm.
Sure. This ties in to what Castlen was saying about how each company really has to kind of decide how they're going to engage on this. The service providers, like I said in the beginning, you think of them as the contractors. The operators, they're the leaseholders. They're deciding what permits to produce and drill on. But the service providers come in and they produce the wells. They kind of produce the energy that comes out of all of that. Now, the way that they are looking at ESG and the adjacent concept of energy transition or energy evolution changes from their shareholders as well. A service provider actually has a unique opportunity that an operator may not have, in the sense that they're developing technology. So one example, the NOV that I mentioned in the beginning, they manufacture rigs. They manufacture amazing onshore and offshore rigs, and they have developed extraordinary technology and automation of what has to happen on a rig offshore. You know what else that makes them really good at is developing wind turbines offshore and the management of that. So, these companies are really looking at what do they have that's adjacent, and companies are kind of trying to fan out. Now, that company isn't going to ever invest probably in a solar venture. It doesn't make sense to their core business. But areas where they're already really, really good, they're going to take advantage of that. So, kind of in answer to your question, the service providers as the contractors, they struggle with labor. Labor is an issue across industries right now. Obviously, the supply chain crunch, that was already started kind of before Russia, Ukraine, is significantly impacting them. So, right now the administration is calling on U.S. producers to produce more. I think the operators could probably do it if we had appropriate infrastructure, but you got to get the crews out there to get it done. And we don't physically have the people. And this gets back to a really interesting conversation around how the industry is perceived, how we're able to attract brilliant minds like you guys to be in this industry and realize what we deliver to the world, whether it's through oil and gas or nuclear or renewables, how much of that is really needed for us to sustain modern life. And so they're faced with these constraints, inflation. So it's not, when we need energy supplies and we need them badly and we're running low, it's not like you can flip a switch and it can happen quickly. And that's why you need a strong services sector and a strong workforce to be able to move around. And these companies need to have the governance structure to be able to navigate ESG while doing that.
I want to follow up on something that you brought up. A long time ago, I was told that the service industry is like a shock absorber in the value chain, right? That when the prices are good, they're the first ones that kind of get to raise their prices, try to take back some of what they lose when they get compressed on the way down, because they're the first ones that sort of get cut. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that impacts this idea of like we're running out of people?
It's actually almost true. It's true on one end. Right. When prices are low, they are the first that gets cut. But when prices are high, it takes about 6 to 9 months to trickle to them for margin improvement because of long-term contracts. So right now, we saw on Capitol Hill a testimony from oil and gas producers, and everyone's enraged about high fuel prices and the price of oil. People in Washington not absolutely understanding that that's a global commodity and that's what drives that price. Those oil prices are not, the services sector has not realized those margins just yet. And so they're fighting against that. They're fighting against inflation, supply chain. And so that's where you kind of see some log jams. And we definitely saw them in the testimony of the large oil and gas companies in Washington last week. And they've said, this is a workforce issue. And it's also an infrastructure issue. And we need all those things in the energy system.
It was very scary. In about 2016, we had a panel with Gene Shepard, who's a local oil and gas entrepreneur. He said his biggest fear was that the service companies would all go bankrupt. There'd be no one for the rebound to be there to actually provide the services they need. And that was an eye-opener for me to really think about how critical that role is in the supply chain. Cass, we've talked a little bit about all the owners of the firm, but in terms of the shareholders, like if you're having a shareholder meeting, what are you hearing from them specifically? The people that we're not sure if they're willing to trade off financial returns for these other kinds of returns.
Yeah, I'd say there's two things they're asking us for right now. And again, Apache is an E&P company. We're only in the upstream. We're a global company, so we're in 4 different countries right now. But we explore for and produce oil and gas, and then we sell it, and it goes into the midstream, and we're out of the business. So for companies like us, also known as like large independent producers, the two things that we're being asked for is, number one, we need you to focus on returns. And by that, they're very clearly meaning money. And the reason for that is because over the last 10 years, the sector has severely underperformed. In 2008, upstream oil and gas companies represented about 15% of the S&P 500. Today, it's 3%. And the reason for that and the shift away from an investment perspective from oil and gas is it's easy to think a lot of that's ESG motivated. And I think there's some of that in there, but at the end of the day, money market and money managers are motivated by delivering value for their clients. And so if they're invested in your stock and you're not generating a return, they're going to go somewhere else where they can make a return. And so we saw tremendous outflow of money from the sector. Interestingly, today, because of where commodity prices are and just kind of all of the other global complications, it is the top performing sector. I think up since January 1, something like 37% for the sector, where the next sector is at 5%. And most sectors have generated a negative return since January 1st. So you're starting to see something really interesting happening, particularly as it relates to ESG, and that fund managers want exposure to the stocks that are generating the most returns. And so they're wanting to move back into oil and gas. And that's a little complicated because they've made a lot of statements over the last 5 years or so about transition and divesting and all these things. And they're actually starting to change their tune about some of that. The world's largest money manager, BlackRock, has literally done like a 180 on this issue and has started to really say some things around the importance of oil and gas, the importance of the sector in the short to medium term. And certainly the situation in Europe has exacerbated that conversation and whatnot. The second thing they're asking for is when it comes to what is the future of a company like Apache, it's really, a very natural question to ask. Are you guys going to invest in wind, or are you going to move into solar or add that to your portfolio? And we have employees that ask that of our CEO. And the answer is no, we're not. And the reason is because we are very focused on one thing, and we're very good at that one thing, and that's finding and developing oil and gas. And we're confident that there is going to be a need for that product for decades to come. Now, will everybody get to still play in that space? No, they will not. The best producers that can deliver the lowest cost energy and do it in a way that's environmentally responsible will be around to deliver that product, and we want to be in that space. And what our shareholders tell us is that is the most value creation that we can provide. In other words, if we went into something we didn't understand, like wind, we don't have the expertise to do that. That would be capital destructive. And if they want exposure in their portfolio to wind or solar, they will go buy a wind or solar stock. Apache, we're in you because we want exposure to oil and gas.
That's very important, particularly for the finance students. You'll hear this all the time, that a lot of times investors want what they would call like a pure play, right? So you look at, ConocoPhillips, it splits in half because they're like, well, we want to have just the E&P piece and just the downstream piece because we don't want you to diversify. We want to diversify ourselves. So it's just another example of that. Mm-hmm. Do what you're good at, I guess is the basic idea. Do you have any questions so far? Dr. Weber?
Maybe I don't mind maybe diversity of workforce. That's tree services, which is one part that goes the other. And I say, anecdotally, I think that large multinationals, there's diverse workforce, but maybe not in production. And if I look at utilities, gas utilities, are actually quite diverse, but not the line workers.
Right.
The diversity they always add for. So, do you have any kind of
The quick summary of the question is, you can talk about diversity at the whole organization, but when you start to look at the different parts of the organization, they're all parts equally diverse. Fair enough?
I'm happy to answer that first on behalf of services. So like I said in the beginning, this is kind of the field workforce, right? 600,000 jobs. And it is diversity within oilfield services lags significantly behind E&P because more E&P jobs are generally corporate jobs. So the diversity is quite good in oilfield services and corporate and headquarters, but then once you get to the field, diversity drops off because of a number of factors. So one of the things that we started 3 years ago, we did a study to get diversity demographics across the entire oilfield services workforce. It didn't even exist. They weren't even measuring it. And so we were able to discover that there's 16%, at least in 2018, 16% female workforce in oilfield services. We set a target for 20% for 3 years later, developed a toolkit, helping our companies that we work with understand these are the things you need to be able to retain your diverse talent. And some of those things that came out of that were mentorship programs for women, backup childcare, some really specific things. Reviewing resumes without names. That's something that a lot of companies do right now is, it's hard to get people in general. So they're looking at fewer resumes, but when there are multiple resumes to look at, they remove the names from them. So then we went back and did the study again to include race and ethnicity in 2021 in the middle of COVID, and realized there was 19% women. So in a year, when women left the workforce in such strong numbers, we were able to gain 3%, which sounds so low. It's like not even worth celebrating, but it is progress. And so I think, you see that in the workforce. I know we talk so much about culture as part of ESG, and that's where the oilfield services sector is. But Castlen probably has a different view on that in E&P.
Question on that real quick.
Sure.
I think some of that is just the geography. The headquarters is usually in an urban area, but where the work is done is in a rural area. Like if you're in Midland, you've got to bring in healthcare and doctors because there just isn't the infrastructure that would naturally attract people like there is in Houston or Austin or somewhere else. I
think potentially, but what's increasing diverse workforce is automation. So, you don't have as much manual, things happening on the rigs as you used to. And there's so much remote activity being done that we're able to, across every level of diversity, have people that wouldn't historically have been able to necessarily manage a rig from that seat. So I think it's really an emerging technologies that are driving that.
Yeah, I think our experience is actually quite similar. I mean, our workforce is divided between the corporate headquarters in Houston, and then we have large offices in major cities. So like we have a large office in Aberdeen, a large office in Cairo, and we have a large office in Midland. But then we have field offices. I mean, dozens and dozens of field offices. And I can tell you the diversity, particularly from a gender perspective, in the field offices is dramatically different and very probably similar to what service side gender diversity looks like. But in the corporate office, it's also, it's just there's certain functions where you see more women. So for example, in my function, communications and government affairs, I actually have a very diverse team, but there are a lot of women on my team. In accounting, we see a lot more women in the corporate group, finance to some extent, and increasingly we're starting to see it in the corporate roles around engineering and kind of more of the geo work. But again, it's pretty different from what you're seeing out in the field.
Well, that's encouraging. Please go ahead.
Kind of along the same lines in the environmental space, how far up the supply chain do you look at impacts? I mean, if you look at imported pieces of any product, they're coming from some factory overseas. Do you include their emissions or your ESG outlook?
So the question was, in some sense, scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3, or scope 0, right? If you want to go all the way back. So what are you responsible for in terms of ESG, particularly on the E, I think is what you're really worried about, the environmental piece, and are you responsible for the customer, the burner tip, those kind of things? So how do y'all think about that?
Yeah, there's also scope 4 now, which is and I'm sure there'll be a scope 5 tomorrow. But for us, we're focused on scope 1 and scope 2, which are our direct emissions and the emissions of the things that are our service companies that are working with us. Now, there's some parts of scope 3 that technically have to do with service side, but the primary focus of scope 3 is the combustion of our products, at the tailpipe, at the power plant, whatever. We report scope 1 and scope 2. We've set targets for scope 1 and scope 2. But I will tell you, one of the things that we're increasingly doing is in contracts, we have everything from, supplier code of conduct to commitments, ESG commitments. So we communicate to them what our ESG commitments are. And in contracting and proposals, we'll ask for support in terms of how will you help us enable this? So in some, that's not just E, that's also, D&I, we have a really strong supplier diversity program, and some of the other ESG topics as well.
I would say that's similar within services. And there are things that we were already doing in that space before ESG came around, like, conflict minerals. That was something that the supply chain was reporting out. But it's interesting, this conversation, as it starts to touch publicly traded companies and privately held companies. So the tendency up until this point for the privately held companies has been, I don't want to measure that. I don't want to report that. That's onerous and burdensome. And the publicly traded companies can do that. But because the operators are requiring it within their supply chain, then both kinds of companies within services have to start reporting, if that makes sense. So it's not just the SEC is going to make me do it. And this gets back to one of the initial questions that you had, John, like, are the companies themselves going to do this, or does it have to be required by the government? And I think it needs to be collaboration, public-private partnership, of course, but the companies are requiring it. And so therefore, down the supply chain, each company is, as it gets smaller and smaller, is going to have to start reporting all these things too.
Well, there's also private companies and there's private equity-backed companies that are private, and those private equity firms have ESG targets, so their private companies definitely are worried about it. I always hear about the bullets. And I'm a horrible professor, as you can tell, because I should have asked what to define what scope 1, 2, and 3 are, just in case. Because I have a rough idea. But can you go back for the students and just give us a little sense of how you circle those?
I'll let Castlen do it.
There's several different ways.
Yeah, it's actually quite complicated. So I would encourage you to look it up if you want the official definition and not quote me directly. But essentially, it's kind of thinking about it in a tier system. So scope 1 is like your direct emissions. So if we are running a generator on a location to produce power to, whatever the emissions are of that diesel generator. Or the secondary one might be your supplier. So they ran a generator to power their something that was an effort to support your work. And then the third, and again, this one is more complicated. The third one is really messy and complicated. And quite frankly, there's a lot of debate about scope 3 because it really relies on assumptions and calculations that, quite frankly, you're not actually measuring emissions. It's much easier for me to measure my direct emissions on our operations. We know what kind of compressors we have. We know what kind of generators we have, and we can do the calculation. But when you start talking about scope 3, so how much oil Apache produced last year, and then what happens to those barrels? So you make some assumptions around how much of the barrel went to jet fuel and was burned. Okay, what were those emissions? Okay, how much of that barrel, again, Apache doesn't produce jet fuel. We sell the oil, it gets in a pipeline, it goes down to a Valero refinery, they crack it, and then they sell jet fuel and gasoline and all sorts of other things. But as you all know, part of those barrels are not burned. Part of the barrel actually goes to become feedstock for products, petrochemicals, things like that. And so you don't have the same emissions. So there's a lot of controversy around how you calculate scope 3. And for that reason, even some of the big fund managers like BlackRock, for example, have said, this is kind of a mess. And it's actually probably not something we need to be putting a lot of focus on related to targets. And in fact, they've told us, like, don't worry about that right now. Like, we're not gonna focus on it.
I think it's scope 3 is, what if Amazon owns the box? Right? They have to come get it from me and take all the packaging back and everything else. Like, it's a very complicated calculation.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good. Any other questions for you guys? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thank you all very much for being here. I work for a service company.
Awesome.
Texas,
Oh, wow.
we actually did some work with Calva and
Oh, yeah.
about a month there, and I wanted to echo some of what y'all were saying as far as mosquitoes. It's really, I worked in the field for 5 years. Women don't really work. But I think it's good. But I think I mean, I don't think I know it. But I don't really see American companies. So what I'm saying is, so I worked for a U.S. service company. We were purchased by a European service company. When that happened, that's when the focus on and I'm not really seeing U.S. companies put a lot of focus on that as much as I think we should. And that kind of also, I echo that sentiment a little bit when it comes to image. I'm talking about the European majors have really focused on diversifying two alternative sources. But like you said, Apache is not going to. And I understand it makes economic sense. But how is Apache and other U.S. oil companies that have made the same decision? How are you going to? How are your companies going to address the image problems that come with that? Recognizing climate change is a problem, and recognizing that Apache has made the decision not to, not to really address that, which I'm not disputing. But like, there is some image problems.
Yeah.
So like, how is Apache going to address that image problem, diversity problem, and keep attracting workers to alleviate the legal problems that we have, and make sure that we have the oil and gas that I think we need, and that I'm sure y'all will do that. So how do you square this?
Can I try to summarize real quick?
Oh.
So I think
Sorry, that was really long.
No, it's
I
good.
think the summary is effectively that the perception, at least, is that it is not U.S. companies that are leading ESG. It's coming from European companies, and that I think the way I would say it is, if we're going to need to produce oil and gas, one of the reasons to worry about the workforce is if the workforce won't come work in the oil and gas business because of the perception or whatever else, we're stuck. We can have all the financial returns we want, but without the human capital, we're in trouble. Is that fair? And so so now we're back to the people again. So air, water, and people. We heard this
Right.
already, and I know you're thinking about people too. How are you handling this internally?
Yeah. So two quick things. One, a big reason that that's happening in Europe has to do with European shareholders. So European shareholders are very different than US-based shareholders. And we see that. We have some Euro shareholders, and we go market in Europe, and we have conversations with them, and the conversations are totally different. And they want totally different things than US shareholders do. And so part of that is just a function of the pressure that they're under relative to the pressure that US-based companies that have a majority of US shareholders, or majority of their shareholders are US-based. Having said that, Europe is generally like 5 years ahead of us on things of that nature. And it kind of trickles this way. And some of it is shareholder driven. Some of it is politically, some of it's cultural. It's just different. And so I think you're kind of seeing where Europe was 5 years ago is where we are, and we're moving in the right direction, but I expect they'll continue to stay ahead of us in that regard. To the second part of your question about image, one of the things that I talk about a lot, Leslie's heard me talk about this, is I really think that we have framed the future of energy in a way that's created a lot of confusion for the general public. And by that, I mean, and I'm going to specifically take issue with the phrase energy transition, because the word transition means going from one thing to another thing. And in reality, that's not really what this is going to look like. I've heard other people call it energy expansion, energy evolution. We know that our energy system has always been in transition. And there isn't some magical point that we're going to get to in 2050 and wake up and say, wow, oil and gas is gone. Oil and gas will continue to be needed. And I think part of it is a reframing of the conversation and a conversation about what's really possible, and what's going to be pragmatic. The challenge that I have with the climate conversation and net zero is we absolutely believe in climate change. We absolutely believe that's happening. We absolutely know that CO2 is a big driver of that. And we're very focused on reducing our CO2 emissions. But I think the truth is If you think about 2050 and you think that 2050 has zero oil and gas in it, which I think some people think, if you ask people, what does energy transition mean? That's what they'll tell you. The problem is the most aggressive IEA scenario to get to 1.5 degrees warming by 2050, the global energy mix still requires 20% coming from oil and gas. So think about that for a minute. That's the most aggressive scenario, which quite frankly is probably not going to happen. And I think part of it too is the conversation around what energy should look like is really complicated. And we can't just solve for climate. Like we actually have to solve for a lot of things. We have to solve for energy security. We have to solve for economic practicality. So anyway, I think it's so much more complicated than I think we've led the general public to believe, in a way that's actually been really unfortunate, because I think it's created some of these PR and kind of public perception challenges.
I will just pick up on that because I agree 1,000% with all of it, and then add to it. Right now is the time, I think, where the conversation is starting to change a little bit with the realization of how critical energy security actually is. The energy situation in Europe was tough long before Russia-Ukraine happened. They did not have enough supply. They didn't have enough diversity of supply. They tried to transition 100% to renewables too quickly, without thinking about, a realistic backstop. And so I think the world is actually realizing now we're going to need oil and gas as our most dense energy source because of the technology that's coming out of the industry that abates the emissions of that. And like Castlen said, the conversation about thinking that oil and gas is ever going to go away. Oil and gas are an important part of the renewable supply chain. We don't even say that. You can't even get wind energy without some forms of hydrocarbons. You can't get batteries without some forms of hydrocarbons. So it's just, we have to get on top of this conversation about what the truth actually is. There was something else I was going to say on that before I get on my high horse.
There's another angle to this though too, about energy poverty. And I don't want to, I'm sure you have another great question to ask, but if I can go down this rabbit hole for a minute, because again, going to this idea that this is complicated and it's going to take, you're trying to balance for a lot of different variables. And one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting to watch play out over the next few years, the COP, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, the UN's Council of Parties, they're the ones that meet every year. Governments send negotiators to negotiate what the future commitments will be of those companies relative to their own emission reduction plans. And last year, the COP was held in Glasgow, Scotland, in Europe, one of the most progressive continents on the planet, first world, lots of wealth, opportunity to do things, lots of investment on the renewable side. This coming year, or this year rather, in November, it's being held in Egypt, on the continent of Africa. And the COP rotates continent by continent every year. And the host country represents their continent in that conversation. And the conversation about energy and the future of energy in Africa is very different than the conversation about energy in Europe. And a big part of that is this concept of energy poverty. And the fact that, we have 800 billion or 800 million people on the planet living without any access to electricity, almost 2 billion people with no clean cooking sources, things like that. And in Africa, they are very quick to point out that their entire continent generates only 2% of global emissions. I was in Egypt in February at a big conference. It's a big oil and gas conference. Ministers from all over the continent were there. And the minister of Equatorial Guinea, a country which is blessed with significant oil and gas resources, and they're working to develop their resources, made a comment about the COP. And he said something about, I'm looking forward to the COP and the conversation, but I don't want the Europeans to come down here and wag their finger at us about what we're going to have to do to restrict our emissions when the developed world has benefited from burning hydrocarbons and pulling their people out of poverty and into prosperity for the last 100 years. Next year, it will be held in the UAE. Another country which is taking, the UAE is very interesting, and I would recommend you guys go and look at ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi
National.
Yeah, National Oil Company. Their CEO is actually also a minister of, he's like the Minister of Technology and Climate for the UAE. He is their climate negotiator and their climate envoy to the COP. And he has put out some really interesting and really thoughtful pieces about what a pragmatic approach to the future of energy could look like. Obviously, he's biased. They want oil and gas to play a role as the UAE, a major oil and gas producer. But anyway, all that to say, I think the COP conversation and the climate change conversation will undoubtedly take on a little bit of a different angle over the next 2 years that could have ripple effects for the broader conversation globally.
Well, it's not just global, right? TEPRI, the Texas Enterprise for Research, Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, A-. TEPRI is run by Becky Klein, and it's designed to look at particularly South Texas, but there are lots of people in Texas that would be classified as what we call energy poverty. Like they spend 30% of their income on energy, which is a huge fraction for most Americans.
I would just add to part of that energy poverty conversation ties back to the fundamental role of energy, natural gas specifically in food production. There's one of the CEOs of the large services companies, a guy named Chris Wright. He's CEO at Liberty. And he talks a lot about we will have a critical food crisis in the world if we attempted to stop the production of natural gas just because of its relevance in the development of fertilizer and the way that we grow our food and where our food comes from. So I think the industry has to take the mantle of energy poverty, energy security, and really move those messages forward. And that's the only thing that's going to help, our image and help us attract the workforce that we need. Because I cannot imagine anything more important than having a role in this industry that leads to lower emissions production of the energy resource that we need. Like if I was back at UT, like this is exactly what I would go into. It's exciting. And you see people want to go into tech and they want to design an iPhone, whatever, give me a break. Like that's not that exciting. This is exciting and meaningful. And I think it's really easy to get passionate about it. We just need more passionate people in our industry.
Luke, I think you had a question.
So emission standards and regulations vary across countries. So how do your companies that might be multinational incorporate company goals across the different locations?
So if you're a multinational, how do you take into account the fact that every place has a different set of rules when you're building your set of objectives and targets?
You want to start with that again?
Sure, it's hard. And I mentioned Egypt. Egypt has very different environmental regulations from the United States. And the United States has the most stringent. We also operate in the UK, which has very stringent air emission requirements. The good thing is we know how to do that to that standard. So even though you're not legally required to do that in other areas, we have the ability to do it at a cost that's probably lower than if that was the only country where we were operating. I will tell you the tricky thing about some countries and being able to do that is countries that own their resources and have state oil companies. They usually have a different model in the way that they partner with international companies. So for example, in Egypt, there is a state-owned oil company, and Apache partners with that company and develops JVs like Calda. We operate in those countries under a production sharing contract. And that production sharing contract requires that every expenditure be approved by an Apache person and an EGPC person, which is the petroleum ministry there. That makes spending money on things that do not generate the highest return possible very difficult, because they are not required by law to do some of the things that we might do from an emissions standpoint. We recently renegotiated our contract with them last year and specifically built in an ESG requirement because we said, we have to do these things, we want to do these things, and if we can, for example, increase compression and capture more gas so we can reduce flaring, for example, we'll sell that for you. So we'll be able to make some money, but we need you to trust us in bringing in some of this technology to reduce emissions. But it's tricky.
And I would say that applies to government administrations as well. I mean, there were certain EPA regulations that were around during the Obama administration, and then the Trump administration came in and removed them, and then the Biden administration came in and put them back in. So generally, companies will just stick with the emissions reduction things. There weren't companies that were like, oh, cool, this is going to last forever, we're going to release on those. So even as administrations changed, we didn't see a lot of companies slipping on what the specific EPA requirements.
Anybody else? All right. So one of the things, I think it was Castlen brought it up, there's this idea of diversity on the board as well. And one of the earliest forms of this I was aware of was during graduate school. Our now president of the university wrote his dissertation about board composition. And in those days, there were insiders and outsiders and what they called grays, which were people that were sort of blended, right? This idea that if everybody on the board is from sort of came up through the ranks of the corporation, that it would be sort of biased towards remaining the same. We saw a very strong example of this recently when Engine One submitted a shareholder proposal related to climate disclosures and board seats at the Exxon annual meeting that ultimately passed. And so could you comment a little bit on that? And then for the students, we were having an email discussion. One of the questions that came up with, what is the difference between an activist investor and an interested investor, I think, something like that. And so can you talk a little bit about what we mean when we see in the news, we have an activist investor in our midst?
You may start? Sure. I'll start with a part of that. That's a whole lot of
corporate
questions.
board. So she can think of that.
So I'm on a corporate board, and BlackRock is an investor in the company that I am on the board of. And because they are, and they require at least one person that's gender diverse. When I was hired to that board, they were only interviewing women. And okay, that's fine. You know, I think that we need that in a lot of companies. And it didn't bother me one bit. That was why, you know, that interview process went the way it did. They needed diversity of thought on that board. After that, after I was on the board, I became the chairman of the nominating and governance committee, and I hired the next director to that board, and he had a background in renewables, specifically hydrogen renewables development. And so you're just constantly, as you get one diverse board member, you're going to slowly but surely increase your diversity. And I think it's so important because now that I have been on that board for 2 years, and I'm able to look back and I see some of the conversations that they were having and some of the decisions they made in the past 5 to 10 years, because every single person on that board was pretty much the same. They had very similar backgrounds. They looked kind of the same. And the things that the new director and I bring to that board have fundamentally changed the company. And so I think it is such an important part of the industry. So, and then an activist investor for us, you know, it is someone, and they have to file something specifically. So management knows that they have intent as they file those documents, and it's up to management and the board to maintain conversations with them and know what their interests are. And it has been an extraordinary education for me on that board, learning all of that. But there's like Castlen started with, there's nothing more important really than the direction of the board for that company. And I have seen firsthand how even above and beyond what the CEO wants to do, it's really the board of directors that are driving what kind of change happens.
Can I ask a follow-up question about that? I'm always curious about this because I think these rules are great. Do you think that the rule is designed to sort of set up equal opportunity at the starting line or the ending line? Like, are they looking at, you know, were you on the board for 20 years, or did we give a good diverse set of people a chance to be on the board? Like, how do you think that ESG is being managed on that front? See what the decision?
I do. I think they want to give good, diverse people a chance. The problem is most companies, when they're looking, most nominating committees, they want someone who has been a CEO. And in services, that's difficult because there are, of the 400 large service companies, there are 2 female CEOs. They're on multiple boards. There's only so much of that to go around. So you do have to then go to the next level. And that's what a diversity pipeline development looks like. You go down to the next level and you give someone a shot to get the experience to get there. And that's what I think diversity requires.
No, that's interesting.
So interestingly, this morning we had an employee event, like a town hall, a virtual town hall with our employees, with 4 of our board members, and two of them were oil and gas executives. One of them had been the CEO of another independent producer. One of them came from BP, was like a number 2 guy at BP, but the other 2 brought tremendous diversity of thought to the boardroom. And they happened to be an African American and a female, but that wasn't actually why they bring tremendous diversity of thought. The female board member was the chief investment officer at Invesco, which is a huge money manager, and an investor in Apache. So she brings to the board the perspective of large shareholders. The African American is a retired high-ranking military official who happened to be stationed in Egypt for 3 years, which again, Egypt is a very important part of our business. We're the largest US investor in Egypt. And he has tremendous knowledge of just kind of global, he gave this great rundown on Ukraine and his perspective on what was happening. And I thought to myself as I was watching it, like, man, I could listen to both of them all day, because these are perspectives that I don't hear all day because I work at an oil and gas company. I know how oil and gas company executives think. And while the 2 board members that have that brings additional value to the room, but those 2 perspectives were just so different and just so, they were awesome. To your question about activism, to me, the way that you really define it is passive versus active. Right? You can be a shareholder in a company and, you check how the stock does every once in a while. You may even vote your shares when it comes time for the annual meeting and the proxy. But you're not there to affect change with how the company's strategy is unfolding. An activist investor is going to use very specific tools to get the board's attention and try to change something. Sometimes they do that by trying to get something on the proxy for vote, which is what Engine One did. Sometimes they want board seats. Sometimes they just want to buy a lot so that they can have a big, loud voice. This is what Elon has done with Twitter, and in fact, turned down the board seat because it will prevent him from buying more than 14% of the company and becoming an activist investor. If you join a board, you're basically making a commitment that you're in the boat with them, and you're going to be voted on. If you are a public company board member, you're voted on in the proxy. So it's a different approach. Once you own 5% of a company, you have to file with the SEC. We had an activist investor actually quite recently. It actually stayed non-public for a while because they stayed right under their 5% threshold. They sent us a letter and they said, hey, we just want to let you know, we've acquired like 4.99% of the company, and we would like to have a conversation. And it was about ideas they had that they thought could unlock value for the company. And so we kind of had these private conversations with them on the side for a while. Eventually, they went public with their holding in Apache. When their ideas were actually things we were already working on, we just hadn't been real public about. So they were actually like, oh, okay, good. Glad to hear it. We hope we make money. See you later. Sometimes they don't like what they hear from the executives, and then they launch more of like a public campaign to, oust a CEO or get board seats or pass something on the proxy that could be disruptive to strategy.
We only have a couple minutes left. So because this is primarily a student event, I was going to ask each of you, unless you already started a little bit, that what would you go back and tell yourself when you were in school? Like, what should these students be thinking about as they map out their career trajectories in energy?
I'll say, like, I love this industry. I love working in energy. And I was actually compelled to work in energy because of something I learned while I was at McCombs. And Weber actually is very familiar with this. Dr. Weber was my thesis advisor. He had to step out, but he was my thesis advisor in grad school. And he talked about this guy that was a professor at Rice, Dr. Smalley, who received the Nobel Prize for the buckyball. And he passed away from, I think, a blood cancer in like maybe the mid to late 2000s. But he used to show this slide, and it was like the world's 10 biggest problems. And it had everything from like poverty, terrorism, illiteracy, like all sorts of big problems plaguing the world. And energy was on that list of 10. And he said, there's one thing on this list that if you solve for that, you can actually solve all the other things on this list. And of course, that thing was energy, and specifically access to reliable and affordable energy. And I just found that like so compelling, because I think for all of us, we want to find meaning and purpose in what we do. You're going to spend a lot of time at work wherever you are. I encourage you to spend a lot of time at work and work really hard. But you got to love what you do, and you need to feel fulfilled in what you're doing. And it really needs to align with your values. And so for me, that has been like, I get to do what I love. I get to do and talk about something I'm really passionate about. And so I would encourage you to challenge yourself to think about that too. Don't go into energy if you're not passionate about it, because you'll kind of burn out. The other thing I'll just say is say yes to opportunities that may not make sense. When I was at Apache, I really wanted to be a lobbyist, and I went to DC and did policy, and then got graduate degree at LBJ. And I came back I'd been in the lobbying department for about 5 years, and I had these 2 masters, and I was like ready to take on the world of energy policy. And I got a call one day sitting at my desk. I'd been back like 2 weeks, and they asked me to move to investor relations. I was like, what? Like, you guys just helped pay for this? Like, why would you do this to me? But I did it. It was the best move I ever made, because I learned so much about how public companies make money. I learned about like how C-level set strategy. And it just opened up like all sorts of opportunities for me. At the time, I was like, no, you don't know what you're doing. This is a terrible idea. But it turned out they did know what they were doing. And so I would encourage you to say yes, even when, it seems a little bit out of your comfort zone, or the career path that you think you have perfectly planned and laid out for yourself.
I agree with that, in the sense I didn't start in energy. I was a government affairs person. I did border and immigration policy for KBH in DC. And then I worked on presidential campaigns, and I was at the White House, and I was so passionate about that. I felt like the world began and ended in DC, and the decisions we were making there were the most important decisions. And then I wound up making my way to energy, and I was able to get equally passionate about that. So it's not like you're going to choose something and it's going to be your thing forever necessarily. And definitely don't say no. I have a similar story. As I was getting ready to leave the White House, I worked in the Office of Presidential Advance. I got a call from the Presidential Personnel Office, and they said, hey, we need to talk to you about this other job. And I had already taken some appointments at the State Department, at housing. And I was like, you know what? I'm ready for a break. I had been traveling for 6 consecutive years, spending 1 night a month in DC. And I said, I need a break. No, thanks. I don't care what the job was. And then a few weeks later, my friend Ashley Kavanaugh, who's Brett Kavanaugh's wife, called, and she was like, hey man, I can't believe that you didn't come in and interview for the job I just left. She was the assistant to the president right outside the Oval Office. And I was like, what? And she said, yeah, we got it narrowed down to 3 people that the president wanted to talk to. And they called, and you said you didn't even want to come in. And I could not believe it. I mean, my life was fine. I went on and did some cool stuff, but I have never made that decision again. If someone offers me the courtesy of calling me and saying, we want you to come in and talk to us about something that we think you'd be good at, I go. It does not matter what it is. It doesn't matter how happy I am with my job. And what I do as a promoter of women, when I go in, if I know it's something I'm not going to do or a job I'm not going to take, I go in with the name of 3 women that I know. And I say, it's not for me, but you might want to call these people. But it's a great outlook. And I hope no one has to ever learn that lesson the hard way like I did.
Noted. I like it. It's a great story. All right. Join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much.
There you go.
Dr. Hando.
That was fun. Yeah, thank you.
That was good. I did not.